John Thompson had always been guided by honesty and respect for the land. When trying to buy a private jet, he encounters a wave of prejudice and a much larger plot involving his lands. But with dignity and support, he shows that values are more powerful than money. The sun had barely risen when John Thompson was already up, gazing at the vastness of his land through the window of the main house. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of the earth dampened by the night's dew, creating that unique fragrance that had accompanied his mornings for so many years. His eyes wandered over the fields, stretching as far as the eye could see, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. Every inch of that ground held a story of perseverance. Wearing his favorite plaid shirt, faded by time and labor, John adjusted the straw hat on his head, the same one his father had given him before passing away, and headed out for another day of work. On his way to the main barn, he greeted each, worker by name, genuinely interested in their families and tasks. This was how John conducted his business, with the same simplicity and honesty he had inherited from his ancestors. Hope Farm, as his property was known, had transformed into a true agricultural empire over the years. What began with a few hectares of red soil now stretched for miles, producing the finest grains in the region. But success had not gone to John's head. He remained the same simple man who woke before the sun and knew every corner of his plantation. That particular morning, John had an important meeting with his management team. His eldest son, Peter, a successful lawyer who split his time between practicing law in the capital and managing the family business, was arriving to discuss business expansion. The idea of buying a private jet to facilitate travel between the family's various properties had been brewing for months, and this seemed like the right moment to take that step. "Dad, are you sure you want to handle this personally?" Peter asked as soon as he arrived at the makeshift office in the old barn, now transformed into a modern administrative center that still retained the original rustic charm of the farm. "I can easily go to New York to take care of this for you." John shook his head with a serene smile. "Son, some things you need to do with your own hands. Just like I planted every tree on this farm, I want to personally choose the plane that will help us grow even further." What John didn't mention was the gut feeling he had about this trip. Something told him it wouldn't be just a simple business transaction, but a pivotal moment in his life. He had faced prejudice before, arriving in places with his simple clothes and rural demeanor. Yet, something in his heart told him this time would be different. Margaret, his wife of 30 years, entered the office carrying a tray with fresh coffee and still warm cheese bread. His face, marked by time, still held the same sweetness as when they had first met at a harvest festival decades ago. "John, you need to eat properly before the meeting starts," she said, with that maternal tone she used with everyone around her. As they enjoyed breakfast, Peter began detailing the preparations for the trip to New York. The executive aircraft dealership they had chosen was one of the most prestigious in the country, known for catering to businessmen and celebrities. John listened attentively, but his mind wandered to the stories his father used to tell him about perseverance and dignity. "Value isn't as important as respect," old Anthony Thompson, John's father, used to say while they worked together in the fields. A man can have all the money in the world, but if he doesn't have self-respect and respect for others, he has nothing. The meeting with the team went smoothly, with discussions about the current logistics of the farms and how acquiring the jet could optimize operations. John had been saving for years for this moment, stashing away every penny with the same discipline he applied to his business. The money was available, but he insisted on making a thoughtful and well-planned purchase. In the late afternoon, as he walked among the coffee plants, John was surprised by an unexpected visit. Mrs. Connie, an old friend and a prominent businesswoman in the agricultural transport sector, arrived unannounced at the farm. Her imported car stood out against the rural landscape, but her presence was always welcome. "John, I heard you're thinking about buying a plane," she said after the initial greetings. "I came personally to give you some advice. New York is not like our region. People can be different." John smiled, appreciating his friend's concern. "Connie, I've faced a lot of prejudice in my life. It only made me stronger. Besides, honest money has no face or clothes." What John didn't know was that Mrs. Connie had troubling information about certain people who frequented the airplane shop in New York. In particular, about Augustus Prado, a businessman known for his questionable negotiation methods and a history of conflicts with small rural landowners. Night fell over Hope Farm, bringing with it that characteristic peace of the countryside. John remained on the porch for a long time, gazing at the starry sky and thinking about the challenges that awaited him. Margaret joined him, bringing a cup of chamomile tea. "Are you worried about something, John?" she asked, knowing her husband too well not to notice his unease. "It's not worry, Margaret. It's more of a feeling, like something important is about to happen. You know when you can sense in the air that a storm is coming? It's kind of like that." Margaret held his hand affectionately. After so many years together, she had learned to trust her husband's instincts. "Whatever it is, John, you'll face it as you've always faced everything in life, with honesty and courage." The next morning, John woke up even earlier than usual. He put on his best suit, which, even so, was simple compared to the standards of the capital, and prepared for the trip. Peter insisted on going with him, but John was firm in his decision to go alone. "Some battles, son, a man needs to fight alone," he said, as he bid farewell to the family. What John didn't imagine was that this trip would be much more than a simple purchase. It would be a test of his dignity, proof that a man's character is not measured by the clothes he wears or his accent, but by the strength of his principles and the firmness of his convictions. Before leaving, John took one last look at his farm. The first light of day was beginning to gild the crops, creating a spectacle of colors that never failed to impress him. That land had taught him his most valuable lessons: patience, perseverance, and the certainty that all honest work, sooner or later, bears fruit. On the way to the regional airport, where he would catch a commercial flight to New York, John reflected on his journey. He remembered his father, who never had the chance to see the success the family had achieved, but whose teachings were the foundation of everything he had built. He thought of Margaret, his tireless companion, who always believed in his dreams, even in the most difficult moments. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mrs. Connie again. "John, I've discovered some things you need to know about Augustus Prado. He's been spreading malicious comments about you in the capital." John gently interrupted his friend. "Connie, I appreciate your concern, but I'd rather not know. I'll face whatever I have to face with my head held high. It's always been that way, and it always will be." He hung up the phone with a calm smile on his lips. The driver taking him to the airport, a young man from the area who was well aware of the Thompsons' reputation, watched through the rearview mirror the man who, despite having achieved so much, kept humility as his greatest wealth. The sun was already high when the plane took off, carrying John toward New York and the challenges that awaited him. In his suitcase, besides the money for the business, he carried something far more valuable: the certainty that, no matter what happened, his values and his dignity would be his best defense against any prejudice or attempt at humiliation. The landscape gradually changed through the airplane window. The lush fields gave way to a forest of skyscrapers, signaling the approach of the country's largest city. John closed his eyes for a moment, recalling his father's words. "Son, always keep your feet on the ground and your heart clean. The rest, life will take care of." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and let's continue. The afternoon in New York was particularly bustling when John Thompson stepped out of the taxi in front of the luxurious executive aircraft store. The mirrored building reflected the sunlight, creating a striking contrast against the blue sky. John adjusted his hat, a gift from his father, and took a deep breath before walking through the automatic glass doors. The interior of the store was even more impressive than its facade. The Italian marble floor shone like a mirror, reflecting the miniature aircraft models that decorated the space. Executives in impeccable suits moved about, speaking in hushed tones about million-dollar deals. The air conditioning maintained a pleasant temperature, but John felt a shiver run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the sudden change in environment. Ronald, the store manager, was at his desk when he noticed the unusual presence. His eyes scanned John from head to toe, lingering for a few seconds on the straw hat and worn-out boots. With a smile that looked more like a grimace, he slowly approached. "Can I help you?" he asked in a tone that suggested exactly the opposite. John maintained his dignified posture, as he always did in similar situations. "Good afternoon. I came to see the executive jet models. I'm interested in making a purchase." Ronald's smile widened, now with a visible touch of mockery. Of course. And what kind of aircraft are you looking for? Perhaps something more suited to your profile?" Before John could respond, a familiar and unpleasant voice echoed through the room. Well, if it isn't John Thompson, the king of coffee." Augustus Prado had just entered the store, his Italian suit and designer shoes contrasting sharply with John's simplicity. His eyes gleamed with mischief as he approached, followed by two assistants carrying leather briefcases. "Here to buy a plane, John, or just sightseeing to tell your grandkids about?" Augustus taunted, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. John remained calm, recalling his father's teachings about dignity. "Good afternoon, Augustus. I see you're still as polite as ever." John's ironic remark only fueled Augustus's hostility further. The other customers in the store began forming small groups, watching the scene with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Some whispered among themselves, while others didn't even bother to hide their laughter. Ronald, sensing the potential for an awkward situation, tried to intervene. "Gentlemen, perhaps it would be better." "Let it be, Ronald," interrupted Augustus. "Our friend John here must be used to this kind of situation. After all, not everyone is born with a silver spoon in their mouth, right?" The snide remark reverberated through the room, eliciting more restrained laughter. John felt the weight of every gaze, every mocking smile, but he stood firm. His years of hard work on the Porto land had taught him that the strongest storms are often followed by the most beautiful days. It was at that moment that Mrs. Connie made her triumphant entrance into the store. Dressed elegantly and exuding an aura of authority, she immediately captured everyone's attention. Her high heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor as she approached the group. "John, my friend," she exclaimed, embracing him with genuine affection. "What a coincidence to find you here. I just came to get my jet serviced." The atmosphere shifted subtly. The mocking smiles gave way to expressions of surprise and confusion. Ronald, in particular, seemed to have swallowed something particularly bitter. "Mrs. Connie," greeted Augustus, visibly uncomfortable with the businesswoman's presence. "I didn't know you were acquainted with our friend John." "I know and greatly admire his work," replied Mrs. Connie with a firm smile. "John is one of the largest grain exporters in the country. His products are a benchmark for quality across the entire international market." The revelation had an immediate impact. The whispers changed in tone, and several faces turned red with embarrassment. Ronald, in particular, seemed to have been struck by lightning. "Mr. Thompson," he said, now with exaggerated formality, "please forgive my initial rudeness. Allow me to show you our premium line of aircraft." John maintained his serene demeanor, as if nothing had happened. "Of course, but first I'd like to see the model I researched. The Citation XLS Plus, please." Augustus couldn't hide his irritation. His plans to humiliate John were quickly falling apart. With a brusque gesture, he called his assistants and began heading toward the exit. "One last thing, Augustus," John called out, his voice calm but firm. "That proposal to buy my land, you can forget it. It's not for sale. Not now, not ever." The businessman paused for a moment, his tense back revealing his contained fury, but he continued on his way without looking back. Some clients who had previously laughed at John now tried to approach him, interested in getting to know the man who had just demonstrated such dignity. Mrs. Connie watched everything with a satisfied smile. "Shall we see the planes, John? I'm sure your experience with agricultural logistics will be very useful in making the choice." As they walked through the showroom, John noticed that the atmosphere had completely changed. The looks now were of respect and genuine curiosity. Ronald went out of his way to give attention, explaining every technical detail of the available models. "You know, Ronald," said John as he examined the cockpit of one of the planes, "my father always said that a man's true wealth isn't in what he has, but in what he is. Money can buy comfort, but it can't buy character. The manager lowered, his eyes visibly embarrassed. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Thompson, and please forgive me again for the initial reception." The afternoon progressed as John carefully analyzed every detail of the planes on display. His experience with agricultural machinery had taught him to value not just appearance, but above all the functionality and durability of the equipment. Mrs. Connie stayed by his side, sharing her own experience with executive aviation and offering valuable advice on maintenance and operation. Her presence wasn't just moral support, but also technical, as her knowledge of the aviation market was widely recognized. "John," she said in a more private moment, "you turned a moment of prejudice into a lesson in dignity. That's why you've gotten where you are." As they discussed the final details of the negotiation, John received a call from Peter, his son. "Dad, is everything okay over there? I was worried." "Everything's great, son," John replied calmly. "Sometimes people need to learn that a man's worth isn't in the clothes he wears, but in the character he carries." The negotiation lasted until late afternoon. John chose the model that best met the needs of his farms, negotiated the price with the same skill he used in his agricultural dealings, and closed the deal with the satisfaction of someone who knows they made the right choice. When he finally left the store, the sun was already setting on the horizon of New York, painting the sky with shades of orange that reminded him of the sunset at his farm. Mrs. Connie insisted on taking him out to dinner, an opportunity to celebrate, not just the purchase of the plane, but especially the victory of dignity over prejudice. "You know, Connie," John said during dinner, "today something bigger than a simple purchase happened. It was proof that my father's teachings were right. Humility and honesty always win in the end." While savoring their meal at an elegant restaurant, overlooking the city, John couldn't help but reflect on how the day had turned into something far more significant than he had imagined. The initial prejudice had given way to respect, and his dignity had spoken louder than any attempt at humiliation. The dinner with Mrs. Connie stretched late into the night at the upscale New York restaurant. Between conversations, she finally revealed something she had been holding on to since the start of the day. "John, I need to tell you something," she began, her expression turning more serious. "The truth is, it wasn't a coincidence that I was at the store today. I found out that Augustus was planning something against you." John gently set his utensils down on the plate and looked at his friend intently. The soft sound of the piano in the background seemed to amplify the tension of the moment. "Augustus has been spreading rumors about your land, John. He's been telling investors that you're in financial trouble and will need to sell your properties soon. That's why he showed up at the store today. He wanted to humiliate you publicly, to give weight to these rumors." The revelation didn't surprise John as much as it might have. Years of experience in business had taught him to recognize the underhanded tactics of certain entrepreneurs. What intrigued him was the reason behind so much insistence. "There's more," continued Mrs. Connie, lowering her voice even further. "I found out he's negotiating with a multinational. They want to buy all the land in the region for a large monoculture project. Your properties are the only thing stopping the deal from moving forward." John took a sip of water, processing the information. His land wasn't just a business, it was his legacy, the fruit of generations of hard work and dedication. The idea that someone was conspiring to take it from him deeply troubled him. "And there's something else you need to know," added Mrs. Connie, hesitating. "Augustus managed to access some old documents from your family. He's questioning the legitimacy of the original deeds to your land." John's heart quickened slightly. He knew exactly which documents she was referring to. It was an old story, one his father had told him years ago, about how the family's first lands had been acquired. The next day, early in the morning, John was surprised by a call from Peter, his son. "Dad, I need to tell you something important. I just received a legal notice questioning the documentation of our land." "I know, son," replied John, his voice conveying a calm that only years of experience could bring. "Mrs. Connie warned me about this yesterday, but don't worry, we have all the documents in order." Peter, however, didn't seem so calm. "Dad, they're using very specific technical arguments. They claim there are irregularities in the original land demarcations. We need to prepare for a legal battle." John knew this was just the beginning. Augustus was playing all his cards, trying to pressure them from every angle. But he also knew he had powerful allies, people like Mrs. Connie who knew his character and the history of his family. During breakfast at the hotel, John received another important call. It was Margaret, his wife, with news from the farm. "John, something strange is happening here. Several buyers have suddenly appeared, all offering prices well above market. A value for our land. Don't accept any offers, Margaret," John instructed. "And tell the foreman to double the vigilance. I'm sure these are people sent by Augustus." The situation was escalating faster than John had anticipated, but years of working the land had taught him that the greatest harvests often come after the fiercest storms. That same morning, as he prepared to return to the farm, John received an unexpected visit in his hotel room. It was Robert, a former employee of Augustus, who had worked for his company for over 2 decades. "Mr. John," Robert began, visibly nervous, "I came because I can no longer stand the injustices Augustus is committing. He's not acting alone. There's a group of businessmen behind him, all interested in your land." John listened carefully. Has Robert revealed details about the scheme Augustus had set up? The plan was much bigger than simply buying their land. There were international interests involved, large-scale projects that would completely change the face of the region. "And there's more," continued Robert, his voice trembling slightly. "They found out about your Uncle Anthony, the one who helped your father buy the first lands. They're using that to try to invalidate the deeds." The mention of Uncle Anthony made John close his eyes for a moment. It was an old story, one few knew about. His uncle had financially helped his father purchase the first lands, but had insisted on keeping his name off the documents. "Robert," said John after a moment of reflection, "I appreciate your courage in coming to tell me this. But don't worry, my father and my uncle did everything by the book. I have all the documents safely stored." After Robert left, John made one more important call, this time to an old friend who worked at the city's registry office. He needed to be sure all the paperwork was truly secure. Meanwhile, at the farm, Margaret gathered the oldest employees. She knew they needed to stand united during this difficult time. Many of those men and women had grown up there. Their children studied at the school John had helped build. Their lives were intertwined with that land. Peter, on the other hand, was beginning to mobilize a specialized legal team. As an experienced lawyer, he knew they would need all the documentation possible to face what was coming. By the end of that afternoon, John boarded the flight back, home with a folder full of documents about the new plane and a head full of worries. But he also carried with him a renewed determination. Those lands represented much more than a family heritage. They were the symbol of a lifetime of honest work. During the flight, he allowed himself to recall the early years when his father and his Uncle Anthony worked side by side, dreaming of the day when those lands would become a productive farm. He remembered the nights when the two brothers gathered around the kitchen table, making plans and sharing hopes. The sun was already setting as the plane began its descent. Below, the Thompson family lands stretched as far as the eye could see, a living testament that dreams, when nurtured with honesty and determination, can become reality. Margaret was waiting for him at the airport, her face showing concern but also that quiet strength that had always characterized her. By her side, some of the farm's oldest employees had also come to welcome the boss. "Welcome back, old man," said Margaret, hugging him warmly. "We have a lot to talk about." John nodded, knowing that the next few days would be decisive. But something inside him was at peace. He had faced prejudice in the big city with dignity and would now face any other storm that came his way, always faithful to the principles his father had taught him. On the way home, watching the sunset paint the fields in gold, John made a silent promise to himself. As long as he had strength, he would fight to preserve not only his land, but above all, the legacy of honest work and dignity that his family had built over generations. The car crossed the dirt roads of the farm when John spotted a group of workers returning from the fields. They were men and women who, like him, had learned to love that land. Their tired but satisfied faces told stories of long days under the sun, abundant harvests, and dreams fulfilled. "Where are we heading now, Mr. John?" asked the driver, a young man who had grown up on the farm. "Home, son," replied John, his gaze steady on the horizon. Always home. The next morning dawned with a soft mist covering the fields of Hope Farm. John, as usual, was the first to wake. While having his coffee on the porch, he watched the employees arriving for another day of work. Each familiar face carried with it a story of partnership and trust built over the years. Peter arrived early, carrying a folder full of documents and a worried expression. "Dad, I reviewed all the documentation last night. Augustus is exploiting a legal loophole related to how Uncle Anthony participated in the initial purchase of the land." John listened carefully as his son explained the legal details. The issue was more complex than they had initially imagined. Augustus had found old records suggesting a possible irregularity in the land transfer, something related to Uncle Anthony's undocumented involvement in the deal. "But we have something in our favor," Peter continued, his eyes shining with sudden hope. "I found an old diary of Grandpa's kept with the original deeds. In it, there are detailed records of all the transactions, including Uncle Anthony's participation." At that moment, Margaret joined them on the porch, bringing more coffee. "John, Mrs. Connie is on her way. She said she has important news." As they waited for Mrs. Connie's arrival, John decided to take a walk around the property. Every step on that red soil brought back memories of a lifetime of work. He remembered his father saying that the land was more than a material asset, it was a commitment to the future. Mrs. Connie arrived shortly after, driving her own car. Her expression was one of someone bearing significant news. "John, I've discovered something that could change everything. The multinational behind Augustus has a questionable track record in other countries. They're being investigated for predatory practices in land acquisition." The revelation brought a new angle to the situation. It wasn't just a local dispute, it was part of a much larger scheme. John, however, maintained his characteristic calm. Years of experience had taught him that the greatest battles are won with wisdom, not haste. "There's one more thing," added Mrs. Connie, pulling some documents from her folder. "I found records showing that Augustus tried to do the same with other landowners in the area, but most resisted and held on to their land." While discussing the discoveries, a group of neighboring farmers began arriving at the farm. They were families who, like the Thompsons, had built their lives in that region. They came to offer their support and share their own stories of resisting Augustus's pressures. "Mr. John," said Joseph Silver, one of the oldest farmers in the area, "we're all in this together. Our lands are not for sale at any price." The unity of the local farmers was a decisive moment. Together they represented not just a group of landowners, but an entire community that had grown and thrived thanks to their work on the land. As the meeting took place on the porch of the main house, another surprise awaited John. Robert, Augustus's former employee, had gathered more crucial information. The multinational company was facing problems in other countries due to questionable practices in acquiring farmland. "Mr. John," said Robert, "they're starting to back off in several places. The pressure from public opinion is too strong." Peter, who had spent the morning in contact with other lawyers, brought more encouraging news. "Dad, we found favorable case law in similar situations. The involvement of Uncle Anthony in the purchase of the land, even if not initially documented, can be proven by Grandpa's diary and by witnesses from that time." It was at that moment that Margaret brought an old box from the attic. Inside it, along with photographs yellowed by time, were letters exchanged between Anthony and his brother, John's father. The letters detailed not only Anthony's participation in the land purchase, but also his dreams for the future of the property. "Look here," said Margaret, holding one of the letters carefully. "Your uncle wrote here, 'My brother, this land will be the future of our families. I don't need my name on any paper. What matters is that our children and grandchildren have a place to grow and prosper.'" The discovery of the letters was like finding a treasure. They not only strengthened the family's legal position, but also reaffirmed the values that had always guided their actions. By the end of that afternoon, as the sun set on the horizon, John gathered everyone on the porch of the main house: family, employees, neighbors, and friends. It was time to share his decision. "My friends," he began, his voice steady and calm, Our strength has always been in unity and honest work. We will not allow external pressures to change our values or pull us away from our roots. John's decision was met with emotional applause. One by one, those present stood up, showing their unconditional support. The moment symbolized much more than a simple business matter. It was the reaffirmation of fundamental values that had built that entire community. In the weeks that followed, the situation began to unfold rapidly. The multinational, pressured by investigations in other countries and the growing media attention on its questionable practices, decided to retreat from its expansion plans in the region. Augustus, seeing his grand project crumble, still tried one last move. He appeared at the farm unannounced, this time with an even more generous offer. "John, be reasonable. I'm offering 10 times the market value of your land." John received him on the same porch where so many important decisions had already been made. With his characteristic calmness, he served coffee to the unexpected visitor and replied, "Augustus, you still don't understand. It's not a matter of price. These lands carry stories, dreams, and the work of generations. That is priceless." The arrival of the new jet 2 weeks later was celebrated with a big party at the farm. Not just for the aircraft itself, but for what it represented, the victory of perseverance and dignity over greed and prejudice. On a particularly significant afternoon, John invited the entire community to an event at the farm. It was time to share an important decision he had made with his family. "My friends," he announced, standing on the porch of the main house, "after everything we've been through, I realize that we need to protect not only our land, but also our way of life. That's why we're creating an agricultural cooperative that will unite all the producers in the region. Together, we will be even stronger." John's initiative turned crisis into opportunity. The cooperative not only strengthened the bonds among local farmers, but also created new growth possibilities for everyone. The small jet, which had been the spark of the whole story, became a fundamental tool for expanding the cooperative's business, connecting the region's products to increasingly distant markets. Augustus, seeing his plans completely fail, ended up leaving the area. His last investments were sold to the cooperative itself, which transformed the land into a research and development center for sustainable agricultural practices. On a quiet afternoon months later, John was once again on his favorite porch, watching the sunset with Margaret by his side. The new small jet had just landed at the farm's small airport, bringing Peter back from yet another successful business trip. "You know, Margaret," John said, tenderly holding his wife's hand, "my father always said that the land is generous to those who treat it with respect, but he also said that the greatest treasure we can leave for our children isn't the land, but the values we learn from it." Margaret smiled, deeply understanding the meaning of those words. Hope Farm had become much more than an agricultural property. It was a living symbol that dignity, perseverance, and unity are the true foundations of any lasting success. The sun finally set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and red. It was the end of another day at Hope Farm, but the beginning of a new era for the entire region. An era built on the same values that John had learned from his father: honest work, respect for the land, and the certainty that the greatest treasures are not measured in money, but in dignity and character. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of John Thompson has touched your hearts and left a special message about the importance of values, perseverance, and dignity. To continue this journey of inspiring stories, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives. Find it here by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Share your own stories of overcoming and dignity with us in the comments. Together, we can inspire even more people to hold on to their values and pursue their dreams with determination. Until next time.